Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Service Institute's Mabini Dialogue. My name is Edsel, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon. In this Mabini Dialogue, we will look into the current state of fisheries and the marine environment in the South China Sea and consider a proposal on how to manage them through cooperation among the littoral states, as mandated by Article 123 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So, to present a blueprint for fisheries and environmental cooperation in the South China Sea, we are privileged to have this afternoon Mr. Gregory B. Poling, Director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Mr. Poling oversees research on U.S. foreign policy in the Asia-Pacific with a particular focus on the maritime domain and the countries of Southeast Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause for Mr. Poling.
Thank you. I'm sorry to keep everybody waiting. I'll try to keep my presentation itself relatively brief. I can wax philosophical about the South China Sea sometimes, but I'd really like to get to Q&A and have a good discussion. As a little background, CSIS decided last year to organize an expert working group to debate a path forward in the South China Sea. If any of you have followed AMCI's work, you've probably seen the photos that we've published of the Chinese Island building, or some of the rather depressing analyses that we've written in the past. It started to feel like we were writing the obituary of the South China Sea, and that maybe we could try to find some silver lining, show that with some creative political thinking, maybe there are solutions that could be had. And so after our annual South China Sea conference last July, we organized an all-day workshop of about 25 or so experts, Americans as well as representatives from all of the regional claimants, and we argued about fisheries and environmental cooperation for 8 or 9 hours, and then over a series of several weeks of drafts back and forth, we finally came up with what was essentially a consensus document on how a system for managing the South China Sea fisheries could work. And the overarching idea behind this project was our presumption that the Code of Conduct talks are not at the stage they need to be to tackle something like this, that ASEAN and China haven't really begun discussing details of fisheries cooperation or joint development, and that it would be helpful for a group of well-respected regional experts to show that it actually is possible to make progress, and that we don't have to spend 20 years talking about the COC with no real progress, which is what basically happened from 2002 to last year. And in the future, what we hope to do is take basic model COC chapter by chapter, and with any luck, we'll be able to present a more robust document at some point in the future, months, years, who knows. But the most easiest, and we thought the most critical, was to start with what the chapter on fisheries would look like. I thought I had a whole PowerPoint. Setting that aside, do we have a PowerPoint? Oh, okay. It's way easier if I can show you the map that we made than if I try to describe them and paint a word picture. So while we pulled up, the premise behind this document rests on the idea that for fisheries cooperation in particular, there are plenty of legal avenues that can be pursued within the bounds of UNCLOS and the bounds of the 2016 arbitral award, and that would be in keeping with domestic law in all the regional states, and that would require an agreement to set aside questions of territorial sovereignty for the time being, and set aside questions of maritime delimitation, and simply agree that the fish don't really care where our political boundaries are, and that states have a legal obligation to cooperate to preserve them. And so, as a scene setter, we know that the South China Sea fishery is in imminent danger of collapse. Overall, fish stocks have dropped by between 75 and 90% since the 1950s. In the last 20 years, catch rates for most species have dropped between 66 and 75%. And this is something I think we all knew instinctually, if you read the papers, I'm sure you've seen reports that fishermen have complained that they used to be able to go out for a few hours and fill their nets, and now it takes days or weeks to do the same. And the fish they are catching are small juveniles. In some species have disappeared entirely. Major predators are gone. It's almost impossible to find sharks, for instance, in the South China Sea. And that all of this points to a fishery that is in danger of irreparable collapse. Because once you start catching juveniles, you are basically catching today while betting against tomorrow's fish. And so we could be within 5 or 10 years of a point where you can't turn back, where it will be impossible to replenish fish stocks. And unfortunately, the rate that we're currently going in code of conduct is 20 years old, which is about 10 years too late to have any real impact on this area anyway. So we set out a blueprint based on two central premises. The first is that the regional state should put together a group of scientific experts and academics paired with fisheries managers, so great ministries, some of the different points. Oh, I should point out, when we're talking about the South China Sea, we're really talking about two different fisheries that are interconnected. So you have one fishery that's connected to the reefs, and these are reef fish that live in the Spratlys, the Paracels, Scarborough Shoal, Luconia Shoals off Malaysia. They are tied to those reefs, but they do move. So fish might spawn in one reef and the eggs would drift to another. And this is why overfishing, say, in the Paracels leads to drop-offs in catch-off the coast of Palawan. And even in the reef, there's no such thing as my fishery and your fishery. And then you have the second, the deep water fishery, basically, which are the large migratory pelagic species, tuna and the like. And these, they're not tied to the reefs. They are highly migratory, and so you have to collaborate with, say, Gulf Island countries specific, but both sets of fisheries are threatened here. And the reef in particular is problematic because you already had a crop of overfishing. And then we combine that with coral bleaching and acidification and pollution that was destroying the reef by about 12% per decade prior to the last few years. And then on top of that, we've thrown, over the last 5 years, this massive destruction from mainly Chinese dredging, island building, as well as their giant clam digging, where they take out these fleets of small boats that use outboard motors and explosives to crush the coral and take the clam out. And the result has been 160 square kilometers of reef destroyed on purpose just in the last few years, which is massively stressful for these fisheries. And it could very well mean that we are already at a point where some species might not be salvageable, and we probably won't realize that for a few more years. As an example of how this looks, so this is a reef a mile and a half from Pagasa, and about a mile and a half to the southeast of Pagasa, where one of our working group members, John McManus, had gone scuba diving and took this photo a few years ago. And it was already a stressed reef, and you can see there is no fish there that looks particularly large. You don't see any sharks or large predators, which we know are actually critical to the overall ecosystem of these reefs. But it looks a lot worse today. That's the exact same reef after the Chinese got done pulling all the giant clams out and utterly destroying the corals to get to it. And so at least 29 or 30 other reefs in the South China Sea look just like this. We, AMTI among others in the press, we focus on the 7 that the Chinese built islands on. There are at least 4 times more that they've destroyed, or mainly destroyed, with clam digging. And all of these now need basically to become marine protected areas if they have any hope of coming back, and that would take a decade or more. As was mentioned at the beginning of the moderation, what makes fisheries unique here is that there are mechanisms in international law that allow us, that actually obligate us to cooperate even in lieu of overlapping maritime claims and disputes. And central to this is Article 192 of UNCLOS, which is that all states have an obligation to protect the marine environment. If you go back and read the 2016 Arbitral Award, this is the article that China was most frequently cited as having violated by the court. You also have, unique to places like the South China Sea, an obligation under Article 123 to cooperate on managing fish stocks in a semi-enclosed sea. And this is a recognition that in a semi-enclosed sea like the South China Sea, fish will be born in one area, and they'll grow up in another, and they'll be caught in a third, And it's impossible to manage those independently. There's no way that, say, the Philippines can have a responsible system of fisheries management, and it can work if Malaysia or Vietnam or China don't do the same. Back home, I grew up on the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. We have a similar interstate problem, right? You can't preserve, if 3 states border a bay and only 1 state is protecting the fish stocks, all it's doing is making sure there's more for the other 2 to overfish. And so, if you start from the premise that the fish don't care about our lines, and instead of worrying about who is claiming what for the time being, let's start by worrying about where the fish already live and where they're already threatened, and build out from there, and figure out how we can accommodate our political institutions and our claims to that reality rather than the other way around. This is the list of the original members of the working group who took part in our discussion. We've since added one more, Professor Zhu Feng, who leads the South China Sea Center at the University of Nanjing in China, has come along. So we have both a mainland and a Taiwanese member of the group, as well as a member from every Southeast Asian claimant except for Brunei. And then we have Americans and Australians and Europeans, mainly legal experts and environmental experts, and one Canadian, Rashid Samaila, who runs a pretty robust program that studies fish stock and came up with a lot of the numbers I cited. And so with all of that background out of the way, here is the framework that we laid out. One, as I said, you start with the idea that you need scientists to figure out where the fish are actually threatened, and then you establish a series of marine protected zones based on that. Now, this is not a radically new concept. We've heard ideas like this, the Spratly Islands Peace Park, among others, that rest on the idea that you start with a marine protected area, no-take zones and the like. What is unique about our idea is, one, we want to be careful to be clear. We're not saying the whole South China Sea should become a no-take zone. We're not even saying all of the Spratly Islands should become a no-take zone. I think that's politically unsustainable for the country. It would be very hard to sell. But certain reefs, like those that I showed that have been on the story, those clearly need to be no-take zones. And there can be other areas where maybe we just allow certain kinds of fishing, less destructive methods, artisanal and traditional fishing. And there could be third areas where any commercial fishing is allowed. And a good example of this is the way that the Australians manage the Great Barrier Reef. If you look at the Great Barrier Marine Park, it's not a single park, it's dozens of different parks, and they move year to year. Every year they go out, they study the health of fisheries, and they decide if this reef can be upgraded to, off of the endangered list, or this one should be added to it. And you would want to do a similar thing in the South China Sea, except you would need to do it multilaterally. So you get the politicians out of the way, and you bring in scientists, academics, and the relevant ministries, fisheries ministries, oceans and science ministries, and have them do annual surveys of marine health and decide where protection is needed. Then they lay out a map that everybody agrees on. In advance, all of the claimants would agree that whatever this body's recommendations are is what they enforce. And it would look something like this. This is a piece of the Australian Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. But you can see where the different reefs are. And the yellow is the highest level of conservation. The green is mainly no-take, but there's some small-scale fishing. And the blue is open to sport fishing and commercial fishing. It's not that hard to imagine doing this at the Spratlys, areas of yellow and green, but then in between, maybe in between Palawan and the Spratlys, you allow commercial fishing. And it shifts year to year. But that's, as radical as that sounds, that's actually the easy part, because left to their own devices, I think the scientists and the fisheries managers are perfectly capable of figuring out where fish actually live and are threatened. The difficulty is in enforcement. So given the overlapping claims to sovereignty over the rocks and islands, and still unlimited exclusive economic zone claims, how would you decide who gets to patrol where and enforce where? And we suggest a two-part system in which the occupiers and the claimants are in control of patrolling and enforcing these laws within areas that are 200 miles from your shore and within bubbles of 12 miles around the outposts they occupy. But for that to work, they have to agree in advance that they are not recognizing the claims of others, that this system has no bearing on the ultimate legal status of any of the features, or on the ultimate limitation of claims. These are not, we're not laying out EEZs here. What we're laying out are temporary jurisdictional zones, because the fish need to be protected today, and the limitation of the overlapping claims is going to take decades. Once you do arrest a fisherman, if you catch him poaching at a reef, we insist that prosecution be handled by the flag state. And what this does is it takes fishermen off the table as bargaining chips, which is the way we've seen them treated in the region to date. So, you know, it's not uncommon to read stories about Vietnamese fishermen who are arrested in the Paracel by China, and they get taken back to Hainan. They're held for weeks at a time until Hanoi apologizes and pays a ransom. Or, you know, the Indonesians, very public sinking and blowing up boats is a good example of how they're engaging in politics more than good fisheries management. You get it off the table by disagreeing that if you arrest somebody, everybody's already agreed in advance what the fisheries laws are here. So you can have confidence that if you return them to their flag state, they will be prosecuted. What that looks like, of course, and it's easy to describe it, it gets complicated when you have to start mapping it out. This is the overall map of the South China Sea. Basically, you know, anything that is in the gray color there would be the Philippines' responsibility to patrol and protect. Anything that's green would be China's, blue would be Vietnam's, etc. And everybody would be agreeing that these lines are nothing more than provisional measures to enforce fisheries laws. They are not ultimately the picture of your EEZ, and there's certainly not a recognition that either A, you have the right to an island, or B, that it's actually an island. You can imagine how heated the debate over rocks and islands would get in this scenario if you actually allow this to be a statement about legal status of features. Within the Spratlys itself, you get something like this, where we're not making a call about the status of features, and all the claimants would have to be crystal clear about that in writing when they sign up to this. Some of these are going to be underwater features that have been occupied, some are going to be islands. In all cases, we start with the premise that if you have occupied a reef, if you built a facility on it, your responsibility is to protect it. It might take us 20 years to argue about whether or not you should ultimately be there, but while you are, why don't you go ahead and prevent poaching? And that seems like the only reasonable place to start here, right? We're not going to get the Chinese to abandon Mr. Reef tomorrow, and yet do we really want to let Mr. Reef go without any form of protection for the next 30 years? The same applies to, say, the Vietnamese who occupy a number of submerged features, etc. The one area of clear compromise here is the yellow, so we do have a pocket of seas in the middle of the South China Sea that are beyond 200 miles of the coastlines, and that are beyond 12 miles of any occupied feature. And in this area, the only reasonable solution, we think, would be to have a shared system of enforcing the rules. So anybody can patrol, anybody can interdict illegal fishers. I mean, naturally, some states might be more interested. I don't imagine the Bruneians are going to be jumping at the chance to go patrol throughout the entire South China Sea. But nobody's going to be arguing about the right to do so there. And it becomes an area where you can start developing habits of cooperation. So you could have coordinated patrols and joint patrols. You could put ship riders of one country on the boat of another to make sure that if their flag fishermen get picked up, they're there to enforce the rules. And then you have a whole series of kind of easier measures building off this two-part fundamental solution that are meant to encourage cooperation on science and technology and repair the damage that's already been done over the last few years. The first, and I think arguably the most important up there, is the subsidies issue. For any reasonable system to manage the fisheries here, all the countries have to stop basically paying fishermen to overfish. But this is particularly true of the Chinese. It's well documented that China has a whole separate system of subsidies just for those fishers that go to the Spratlys. They basically get cut a check every year. It's the only way it makes sense to go 800 miles from your coast to fish if you're a small fisherman, is if you know that you don't actually have to turn a profit, because the government will pay you to do it. But all of the region is well, most of the region anyway, is in some form or another subsidizing, whether it's fuel or anything else. And we need to stop that, because it distorts the marketplace, and it encourages fishermen to do something that is ultimately against their own best wishes, which is to catch more than the maximum sustainable yield of fish. It also creates this free-for-all environment where if you're worried that the other guy's fishermen are going to get paid to overfish, you might as well get out there and do it quick before they're all gone. Second, some of these species, giant clams in particular, are probably not coming back, at least to some of these reefs, without some help. And the Philippines is already at the forefront of growing some of these species, especially giant clams, growing them in controlled environments here in aquaculture, and then replanting them elsewhere, and this has worked in places like Tupataha Reef. There's no reason it can't work in the Spratlys. The trick is in the Spratlys, you have to get everybody to agree to stop harvesting them in the first place, right? You're not going to go out and plant a clam just so a poacher can come and take it the next week. So you would need to get the overarching architecture in place, and then you can start doing this. I talked to colleagues in places like the National Ocean University in Qingdao in China. They're trying to replicate similar methods with other species. There's no reason that we couldn't have a consortia of universities and institutions around the region that jointly take care of this, that help raise endangered species and reintroduce them to the reefs. Number 5 is it's pretty clearly geared toward Beijing. Others as well. I mean, the Vietnamese do this some, but we need to have an agreement that nobody's going to purposely destroy coral reefs for any reason, whether it's dredging channels to better supply your island or building a whole new island. It is unacceptable to use construction equipment to dig up a healthy coral reef just to expand your island. And that has to be a starting point for all the claimants. Any construction that is going to happen at the islands, and there's reasonable reasons to do some construction at these features, it should be accompanied by an environmental impact assessment, which, by the way, is already a requirement of international law under UNCLOS. It just doesn't actually happen. You know, the Chinese never issued any EIAs after the artificial island building to explain why it was okay for the marine environment. We need to get back to actually having that happen and making sure that it's shared jointly among all the claimants. And then the last is a general prescription to cooperate on marine scientific research. One of the biggest hurdles to good fisheries management in the South China Sea is that nobody is quite sure how many fish there are, because nobody can really do a good survey. You know, Filipino scientists can go out and survey the health around Pagasa, but they have no idea what the health of fisheries are around Vietnamese occupied reefs or around the Tuava or any of the others, and the same goes for all the claimants. If we can get the politics out of the way and start doing joint marine science conferences in regional countries, joint scientific surveys of the reefs, joint scientific cruises to examine water health, we could have a much better chance of actually bringing these threatened marine ecosystems back. And this is a very surface level overview of this scheme. Obviously, we had a whole group of lawyers from as many different countries arguing for weeks. You can imagine that the actual blueprint is a bit more complicated. You can find the whole thing on our website. It's still, you know, it's about 2 pages, 2,000 words or something. So I imagine the actual scheme, if this ever happened, would be 2,000 pages after the lawyers get done with it. But what we're trying to prove here is that this is doable, that there's no reason that we have to sit on our hands and watch the marine environment in the South China Sea collapse just because the code of conduct talks aren't going as fast as we think they should. And with that, why don't I wrap, and I'd love to answer some questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Poling, for giving us hope that a rather bleak future for the South China Sea could still be reversed through political will and the spirit of cooperation. We will certainly keep your observations and recommendations in mind. Now, I open the floor for comments or questions. Please kindly state your name and office or institution. Yes, sir.
Hello. My name is Edwin Estrada, and I'm from the Foreign Service Institute. I was able to study South China Sea for some time now, and I would just like to put forward some of my comments regarding your suggestions or recommendation on how we can manage the environment in the South China Sea. First off, you said that there should be a management area, something like that. But I think before you establish a management area, first and foremost, I think is you should establish confidence building among the claimant states. That is actually very difficult. There was a similar initiative, similar to your suggestions, and that is JOMSRE, Joint Oceanographic Marine Scientific Expedition, Research Expedition in the South China Sea. It was a confidence building mechanism in the mid-90s to 2008, and it initially was participated in by the Philippines and Vietnam, and then eventually China came in. but for some reason it did not push through. It did not progress into more concrete cooperative schemes to explore and protect the marine environment in the South China Sea. I was just wondering, in your discussions with your members, did John Sir came up? Because I think this is something we can build on. We can build on instead of thinking again another new scheme, management, environmental management scheme in the South China Sea. We can build on past initiatives, and John Sir was very successful because China did not disagree actually with John Sir. At that time, China was even willing to cooperate with Vietnam and the Philippines. And when these three countries cooperate in the South China Sea, everything would be easier because these are the three most active claimants in the South China Sea. With all due respect to Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. No? Secondly, I would like to pose some challenges to your blueprint. Number one, I think there is the difficulty is there is no agreed regional authority that could be set up to monitor and regulate exploitation of marine resources in the South China Sea. And how do you go about it? Who will start the initiative? There were already suggestions before to start a management authority, but it did not push through. And that questions the doability of maybe some of your recommendations. Secondly, territorial issues are still very much in the game. It's so easy to say that you give up territorial issues, but it will always be a main issue for some claimant states, specifically Vietnam and China. Okay. Third factor that would complicate the implementation of this blueprint is the disregard for the arbitral tribunal, which also addresses environmental degradation in the South China Sea. China does not recognize the arbitral tribunal, and we all know that the award is now part of international law. So where do you base the blueprint? I mean, what legal basis will you use? Will the claimants use? If you disregard the arbitral tribunal, what else would they be able to utilize legally? It's so easy to set up mechanisms using UNCLOS, but the problem is still China. China's vague interpretation of UNCLOS. Okay? It's so easy to say, okay, we use UNCLOS to set up legal parameters in order to establish this management authority, but the problem is, how does China interpret UNCLOS, and why can China clarify its claims under UNCLOS as differentiated from its territorial claims? We tried to do that. The Philippines tried to do that for so many times, but still we haven't gotten a clear answer from China. Regarding your illegal fishermen, who decides who are illegal and who are legal? Maybe once illegal fishermen may be legal for some. Maybe the Chinese fishermen fishing within Scarborough Shoal, for us, may be illegal fishermen. On the matter of coordinating efforts to reintroduce giant clams and sea turtles, very ideal. The problem is, what if the country itself is allowing the exploitation of these resources? I was part of a study group, and we went to Scarborough Shoal, and we, the Philippine Navy that time and the Coast Guard confiscated, arrested some Chinese fishermen, confiscated, some of the things they had harvested, including giant clams and sea turtles. And I'm pretty much certain that China knows all about these activities, but China never gave any statement that saying that what the Chinese fishermen have been doing were wrong. So that's the problem. It's the perspective, environmental perspective. For them, it's okay to harvest anything and everything, and this is our way of protecting the environment, but not through preventing our fishermen from harvesting giant clams and sea turtles. All in all, I think, Professor, that your suggestion is very ideal. But is it doable right now? Johnster came before, and it was pretty much successful initiative. It was a confidence-building mechanism that tried to build trust among claimants, but it didn't prosper because of territorial issues, because of issues of sovereignty. The big question is, how do we deal with China right now? It has disregarded international law, and it is very vague in its pronouncements on UNCLOS, how it applies UNCLOS to them. So, how do we deal with China? Thank you very much, Professor.
I counted 7 to 8 questions. No, they're all good. So let me get started at the beginning. Ben, I don't recall what we actually discussed, John. So we discussed a number of previous CBMs that happened both within and without the ASEAN context, and so let me make a general response to the notion of whether or not we need something new, and don't we have enough CBMs to follow through with in the region. So, ASEAN's job is basically to run CBMs. That is what the organization does. And if we lay out a little bit of a timeline here, so the Chinese seized Mr. Greek in 1995, and then ASEAN issued its first ever statement, and its first ever joint statement with the Chinese on the issue in 1996. And then 6 years later, we have the 2002 Declaration of the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, which was supposed to prevent further escalation of tensions. And then it didn't, and then it took 11 years after that to agree upon the guidelines to implement the DOC, at which point China said it would be okay to start talking about the DOC. And then it took another 4 years after that to come up with a one-page framework outline for a DOC that actually says less than the DOC did, so we moved backwards in the last 15 years. And now in March we're going to have the next senior officials meeting on implementation of the DOC, at which we've heard officials from Manila, Hanoi, and Jakarta all say they hope to see the COC talks begin, but Beijing has not confirmed that they're actually willing to start negotiations in March. So, if all of a sudden we come out of these talks in March with a document that marks a real start to COC negotiations, that'll be binding and it'll deal with these issues, I'll be the first to go on hands and knees to the Chinese embassy in Washington and apologize. I just don't see it happening. And so, yeah, there is still a role for CBMs, ASEAN-based or otherwise. And in fact, there's still a role for the Code of Conduct negotiations. I think that it itself is basically a CBM. It socializes the Chinese in the idea that it's better to talk than to bully. But it's not nearly enough, especially on something like fisheries. I'm being generous when I think there's a chance of a COC in the next 20 years. I don't think there's any chance of a COC at all, at least not one that actually deals with these. The COC process, and any conflict-building measure, by their very nature, are limited in scope. And this is not a limited issue. We don't have time to build brick by brick an edifice to protect the marine environment in the South China Sea. We either do it, or the discussions we have a decade from now are not going to involve fisheries at all, because there won't be any left to argue about. And that will make the Code of Conduct much easier, but it's probably not what we want. So my overall point here is that I think all of us who have worked the South China Sea for any length of time, and I'm in that same boat, have grown so cynical. We flew the white flag in our minds like 5 years ago and decided there's no actual hope of diplomatic progress here. And so let's just slowly watch the Chinese eat away at international law and the COC. And we'll write snarky op-eds about it once in a while, and we'll get to act like, Cassandra at the fall of Troy, and we'll be right, but it's not going to matter. But, I think we should at the very least give it another try and get more creative. And I'm not saying that this scheme is going to suddenly be picked up as a negotiating premise by the regional states, but the goal was to try to, we figured if we could get together 25 experts that represented pretty well-respected institutions throughout the region, and who had been working on the South China Sea for years, and get them to agree on a document that they think is legally and politically doable, then it's notionally possible to think the government could do it as well. And that it's nothing else, we at least provide an alternative, so when the next one-page framework document comes out, people can hold it up to something else and say, well, this seems to fall short. How are we actually calling this a code of conduct if all it does is basically have ellipses and subheaders to say someday we'd like to talk about fish and someday we'd like to talk about joint development. As to the question of whether or not you need a regional body to organize this was probably the most contentious debate we had coming up with this, was the question of whether or not you need a regional fisheries management organization to operationalize this scheme. And where we came down was no, but it would be nice. And so the idea that we're going to be able to set up an RFMO or any other new body to manage South Tennessee at the same time that we're negotiating the rules for how to preserve it seems unlikely. I mean, this is a big enough lift. I think what you want to do is have an ad hoc body, an ad hoc framework that can help set up these rules and begin the process, and then see an RFMO, an institutionalized RFMO, as a stage 2. I mean, to give you an example, in the mid-90s, the idea that we were going to have successful counter-piracy patrols coordinated in the Malacca Strait seemed crazy. And if you asked me 2 years ago if the Philippines would be considering hot pursuits within its territorial sea to counter pirates in the Philippine South Seas, that would have been crazy. And all of these things, we can add others, the MRC and the new 6-party information sharing agreement on counterterrorism, all of these are happening as ad hoc sub-regional arrangements outside of the ASEAN context, and without any pre-existing body to organize them. The bodies kind of come later or spackled together. The big question, territorial sovereignty question. So, yeah, sovereignty is still an issue. And, every single part of this blueprint begins with the line, none of this is prejudicial to maritime claims or sovereignty claims. Legally speaking, that is obvious. I mean, legally speaking, the critical date for these disputes happened at best in the mid-90s, and so nothing that has happened in the South Tennessee in the last 30 years has changed the dispute at all. I mean, we heard this argument in the 2016 ruling, right? Nothing you do after a dispute is recognized can change your legal position vis-a-vis the dispute. If you and your neighbor suddenly argue about your fence, you can't go out and move it the next day and say that has changed the dispute. But whether or not parties are willing to accept that as a political decision, not a legal one, and we can't make that decision for them. The point is simply that if you have the political will to try to really tackle fisheries or environmental cooperation or any other of the half-dozen things that probably have to be in a code of conduct, if you got the political will to have those discussions, you have the political will to say that we're not going to continue to argue incessantly about sovereignty while we do it. There's no easy answer there, but the Philippines has outstanding territorial disputes with more than one of its neighbors, and it has managed, for the most part, to collaborate with them. The Sulu Sea and Silva Sea patrols are happening just fine, despite the fact of the continued existence of a territorial dispute over North Borneo. And so it is not unprecedented to think that we can set aside unsolvable territorial issues for the sake of cooperation. The arbitral tribunal, nothing in this runs counter to the arbitral award. And from the perspective of the Philippines, the arbitral award is now a matter of domestic law. I think any scheme, whether it's for fisheries cooperation or joint oil and gas development or anything else, that was seen to be contradictory to the arbitral award would probably be knocked down by the Supreme Court almost immediately. If you look at the map we put together, so we're not touching upon sovereignty questions, and we're not touching upon questions of the legal entitlements here. Obviously, we're not giving any of these islands an EEZ, so that's in keeping with the award. On submerged features, Mischief Reef included, we're not saying that the Philippines should recognize Chinese occupation of Mischief Reef as legal. We're simply saying that the Philippines continues to see Mischief Reef as a piece of its seabed, and the waters over Mischief Reef as part of the Philippine EEZ. But there's nothing in international law that forbids the Philippines from coming to a provisional agreement with China to protect the reef while there's an outstanding dispute. The Philippines wouldn't have to give up anything to do that. We just have to recognize the fact that if we flew over Mischief Reef right now, the Chinese flag is flying. And, we can be right, or we can do something about this. Kind of like when I get into an argument with my wife, I can be right, but sleeping on the couch and being right doesn't really mean that much. The China problem. So there's two answers to this, right? One, if we presume at the outset that China will never compromise on the South China Sea, and that nothing we do will ever change Chinese behavior, then we're all wasting our careers to begin with, right? What have we been doing all this time? I don't think that China is immune to international criticism. I don't think China is immune to reputational damage. If China didn't care about the way it was perceived, it wouldn't have spent more than 2 years trying to force the Aquino administration to drop the arbitral award in the first place. It would have just ignored it. The lengths it went to try to name and shame and debase the International Tribunal showed that it didn't want to have to deal with the international criticism it was going to receive. And so, my second part of the answer is, even if the Chinese are unreceptive at the beginning, it shouldn't be impossible to imagine the claimant states coming together and using something like this. Basically putting together what their own best offer is, what they envision as a management system for the South China Sea, and putting it forward as a joint negotiating position. Rather than the current state of affairs, which is everyone shows up to a COC meeting and they wait to hear what the Chinese are willing to talk about today. And if it's nothing, then everybody goes home and we try again next year. I don't see why we can't have, say, the foreign ministries of Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia sit down and say, this would work for all of us. We can start implementing it if necessary, but let's go to the Chinese, put it on the table, and if Beijing has a better offer, make it. And if Beijing has specific legal objections to this, make them known. But once it's public and out there, the cost for China to ignore it and to stonewall and to knock off alternatives raises. And the Chinese will no longer be able to claim that they are negotiating in good faith, which they are not at the moment. And that also one point that I might not make clear in the presentation. I envision all of this happening outside of the ASEAN context. That's not clear. I don't think that you can actually have a system of marine conservation or joint fisheries development or joint oil and gas development or any of another number of issues that you can do that in the ASEAN context. The organization is not equipped to do it, and it's unfair of us to expect the Laos and the Cambodians and Myanmar to sit down and divide up fishing zones in the South China Sea. There are tons of other sub-regional issues that are not dealt with in a 10-party framework. Nobody complains that Indonesia is not part of the Mekong River Commission. Why do we have to complain that the Cambodians have to be part of the solution to the South China Sea? That ASEAN should talk about the general rules of the road. The claimants should draw up the maps for where they get implemented. Who decides what is illegal? If you actually set up a 7, 8 country body, however many sign on to this, consisting of their fisheries managers, their fisheries ministries, and scientists, and they come up with the map of where MPAs are, then we have an agreed upon definition of illegality. If you are violating those marine protected areas, you are an illegal fisher by definition. And so that should take off the table the problem of countries trying to enforce their own domestic laws in disputed waters. Everybody's domestic law, at least when it comes to South China Sea reefs, would be the same. That the same reefs are off limits, other reefs, certain types of fishing are allowed, and other reefs maybe you can do anything you want. But if everybody is negotiating the rules, then there shouldn't be a problem with interpretation of those rules. And then the last one, what if one of the countries is allowing poaching? Well, we know what happens. Poaching continues. We saw it. That this is how we got to this place when it comes to the reef scarring. I will say that, there's no doubt that from at least 2012 to 2014, the Chinese Coast Guard was well aware of what their clan poachers were doing. We've got plenty of images from ANTI and elsewhere of dozens of Chinese boats digging up these reefs while CPG vessels sit within eyeshot and do nothing. So it's not like it was a surprise to Beijing. Since 2014, the clan digging has effectively stopped. Part of that, I think, is actually commercial reasons. I think the bottom fell out of the market. So Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign made it dangerous to start accepting, illegal clam jewelry, which is basically what it was used for. And so it was hard to sell this stuff. And if you go on Chinese marketplaces online, you can suddenly get clam ivory jewelry for much cheaper than you could a few years ago. And so you have, the New York Times, I think, did a pretty good survey that's where you got warehouses of the stuff of just clamshells stacked up in Hainan that can't be sold. There's also the fact that the Chinese, there is a growing awareness of the problem in academia and among the press. They know that they can't do it without and get away with it now, right? If they started clam digging again tomorrow, I promise that whether it's from MTI or any of a number of other users of commercial satellite imagery, it would be on the front page of every paper the next day. And so the Chinese would suffer a cost for that. They would much rather be seen as the leader in saving the marine environment than the leader in destroying it. And so if this scheme gives Beijing a leadership role in preserving the marine environment, I think they would take it. At least parts of the Chinese government would be willing to take it. And I'll close this long answer session on this. I was just in Beijing and Nanjing in December, and while we spent the vast majority of the week in meetings with government officials and PLA officers getting yelled at about FONOPS, the one thing we could all agree on was the need to do something on fisheries. We might not, they might not be ready to accept a robust scheme to do it yet, but they do recognize the problem. And they know that if they can get it right, in a sense, it's a win-win for them, right? They don't have to give up anything. They don't have to give up their vague notion of historic rights to get this done. And they get to show the world that they can deliver public goods, that they can be a leader in more than just militarization and bullying.
All right, any more questions, comments from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Sandy Arcamo from the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources. I'm just curious why the Great Barrier Reef was used as an example, because there are several congresses wherein the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority have mentioned that the degradation of the marine environment has drastically been experienced for the past few years. So it doesn't seem like a very good example. So I just thought that why was it brought up? And even we were looking, the Philippines was looking after the national marine policy of Australia, but the Australians are always saying that it's not a good example that we should look at. Maybe look at other examples for trying to craft or trying to update our national marine policy.
Yeah, so in the blueprint we cite a number of examples that we want to pull from, and those aren't just the Great Barrier Marine Park. We mentioned the Antarctic Convention and the Antarctic Treaty, and among others. And this is going to be a piecemeal approach. There is no situation in the world in which an outstanding dispute of this complexity over a reef system this stressed and this sensitive has been jointly managed. And so we're going to have to get creative. The reason that I pull out the Great Barrier Reef for this presentation is because it's the clearest example of how you could overlay a complex set of marine protected areas. The problem with the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is not the science behind it or the maps they put out. Those are quite good and remarkably detailed. It's enforcement, right? And so saying that we're going to take the example of how Australian scientists come up with their MPAs doesn't mean that we take the whole hog of the example of how Canberra enforces it. I also find the problem with the Great Barrier Marine Park, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park isn't overfishing, right? It's ocean acidification and runoff and pollution and a number of other issues that also have to be dealt with. But on the question of how do you most successfully analyze the health of a reef fishery and then come up with the restrictions that it would take to bring it back, I think you could find worse examples. But again, remember, this scheme is basically taking one map of MPAs, overlaying it on the South China Sea, and then taking a second unrelated map of control zone, jurisdictional zone, laying that over it. And the two combined give you what this system of management would look like. The first one we have some examples. The second one would be something entirely new. There is no precedent for establishing joint patrol areas like this in a contested semi-enclosed sea.
Any more questions? Sir, just to also pose a question. I think part of what makes this controversial controversial is the geographic elements of it, like these joint patrol zones, and well, MPAs are naturally geographic, but do you think it would be possible to have a fisheries cooperation agreement that do not talk of geography, that doesn't talk of these zones and everything? Or is it not inherent to a fisheries agreement that it should be geographically based?
I think it's necessary. So if you can't really do the MPA part of this without the geography, right? You have to decide which reefs you're going to protect and which you aren't. But so if you establish MPAs, but then you don't decide who is responsible for enforcing them, the MPAs just become one more tool that countries are going to use to compete to show their sovereignty. In the same way that the Chinese use oil and gas drilling and send out organized fishing fleets, you can imagine them enforcing fisheries laws in reefs that are occupied by other claimants just to prove that they have jurisdiction of those reefs. And so the last thing you want to do is create a whole new area of contestation. The idea here is that we want to get away from this idea that everything has to be a bargaining chip in the sovereignty disputes. And so it's not a perfect system. And I don't think that, we're not under any illusions that countries are going to take this map in its entirety and say, you got us. But it proves that this kind of negotiation is possible. So whether you want those bubbles to be 5 miles or 20 miles, it doesn't really matter. It's the underlying premise that we can agree on how to patrol for fisheries issues, because that issue needs to be solved now, in the next 5 years or so, to have any chance of saving the fish stocks here. And we can argue about eventual delimitation. At some point in the future, our children's children can finally divide up EEZs in South China Sea, but we don't have that kind of time. Avoiding those difficult questions is what got us the one-page framework COC last year, which the fishery section of it is a series of ellipses to be decided in the future.
Thank you, sir. Yes, ma'am, from the back.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Fides Quintas from the Foreign Service Institute. I actually have 2 questions. First is regarding your recommendation on cooperation on MSR. Recently, the issue of MSR has been very big in the Philippines, specifically in the Benham Rice region. Because in principle, while MSR is good because first, it is led by scientists. Second, it is for peaceful purposes. And third, even international law actually promotes cooperation on marine scientific research. But because of, there have been suspicions regarding MSR, essentially because of distrust among the parties. So when you actually recommended cooperation on MSR in the South China Sea, how do you think that distrust can be overcome? Second question is with regard to, I am wondering if you also talked about enforcement or monitoring mechanism in your proposal. Because, for example, in your recommendation, the prosecution should be handled by the flag state. I'm wondering up to what extent can we be ensured that the flag state actually prosecutes the illegal fishers operating in the jurisdiction of other countries. That would be all. Thank you.
The MSR, marine scientific research, is a big term, right? It's a wide net to cast, and it includes everything from testing the salinity of water to doing bathymetric surveys. And so we're not suggesting that we need joint MSR in every area. We specifically call out a few things. One is joint surveys of the reefs themselves. And so you get, consortia of 7 or 8 different country scientists to go out and examine reef health. That has no military application. That shouldn't be all that sensitive. The only reason it's sensitive now is the sovereignty question, right? I visited Ituaba a couple years ago at the invitation of the Taiwanese, and I was the first foreigner they've had out in 15 years. Because of this irrational fear that if you let any other foreigner on the island, it somehow is a compromise on your sovereignty. So we need to get beyond that. We also recommend holding joint scientific symposia in the regional countries to discuss South China Sea marine health that could be supported by each of the regional countries. And then the third is we talked about doing joint scientific cruises to test water health and monitor pelagic species. We're not talking about, bathymetric surveys and seabed surveys and the things that have dual military applications, which is a problem in Philippine rise, Venom rise, and that they're part of the problem all over the world, right? So there's an inherent ambiguity within UNCLOS about the blurry line between what counts as marine scientific research and what counts as military research. And I mean, for the record, Washington and Manila are not on the same page here. There are things that the U.S. Navy does within the Philippine EEZ that the Philippines considers marine scientific research and therefore requiring Philippine permission that the U.S. considers a sovereign right as military research. We're not trying to solve that problem with this framework. The second question is difficult, right? So the entire framework of maritime law, fisheries law, right now, as it stands, rests on flag state responsibility for their fishermen. And if the system actually worked all the time, then we wouldn't have any problems with illegal fishing. So this is it's a bigger concern than just our framework, right? The ability of flag states to be held to account for what their fishermen do and to actually enforce laws when they're caught illegally fishing. But in some cases here, so for instance, by having an MPA structure like this and mutually agreed upon, at least it's impossible to argue over the interpretation. If your scientists and your fisheries ministry sat down and agreed on where the no-take zones are, then you can't possibly argue about whether or not that's really a no-take zone. You're the one that laid it out. The biggest concern will be, so say the Philippines arrests fishers who are violating these rules, and they get sent back home, and instead of getting the fine they should, or being subjected to other measures like having their subsidies revoked, they just get a slap on the wrist and sent on their way. That's ultimately a matter of political will, right? We can't ensure that. I don't think there's any agreement that you could possibly sign that would ensure that. There's no international police force that's going to kick in the door in Beijing and force China to comply with an agreement it signs. You just have to trust that the political will that got you to sign the agreement in the first place is going to get you to implement it. And this, again, I can't sit here and promise you that any country is actually going to follow through on this if they ever did conclude the scheme, but countries follow their international obligations more often than not, and it's largely because there are opportunity costs to being seen as an outlaw, and you tend not to break treaties once you sign them willy-nilly. Even the Chinese are still insisting that they're in compliance with UNCLOS because to just walk away would be to take on a whole host of opportunity costs as a rogue regime.
All right. Last round for questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Rio Galasta, also from the Foreign Service Institute. You mentioned that you were in Beijing last December for talks with Chinese officials. Could you just give us a sense of how they think about this issue and what you think their strategy will be going forward?
So there's a difficulty in being an American in Beijing talking to Chinese officials, which is that it is very difficult to distinguish what they say because they believe and what they say because it's being recorded and therefore they want to sound tough. And that's not just a problem for Americans, but I think it becomes even more so because, especially when you're talking to, say, the PLA, you gotta read the party line and do it forcefully. You can't moderate your tone with the Americans. As I said earlier, there does seem to be a crack on fisheries here, where marine environmental issues and fisheries does seem like something that at least some in the Chinese bureaucracy are thinking about, and they know that they need to do something, and they know that if they're, they can't get away with the blatant stuff they were doing just a few years ago, like the clam taking, and that they would like to see it. They would like to find an opportunity to show some regional leadership on this without actually compromising their claims, and maybe this becomes an avenue to do that. More broadly on the South China Sea policy, I think the only reasonable thing we can do is look at the evidence. And ignore what's being said and actually look at what's happening. And the evidence of the last year and a half suggests that if you're a cynic, it suggests that all of the diplomatic outreach and the code of conduct talks are a delaying tactic, right? So we continue to see a steady Chinese military buildup on the islands. This isn't what you do if you are preparing to sign a treaty. It's what you do if you're preparing to use military force either way. The Chinese threatened to use military force against the Vietnamese if they didn't stop oil and gas drilling just a few months ago. The Chinese had a flotilla of Coast Guard, Navy, and fishing ships show up off Pagasa to force the Filipinos back off of construction of fishing shelters at a nearby sandbar. The Chinese have maintained constant Coast Guard patrols off Laconia Shoals and are still using a pretty heavy hand to enforce fisheries rules at Scarborough. So the list goes on and on, right? Things might be out of the headlines, but when you look at what's actually happened over the last year and a half, you don't get the sense that this is a country preparing to sign an equitable treaty with its neighbors. You get the sense of, as I said, a country that's delaying, or, if you want to be more charitable, a country that's of two minds. So maybe you do legitimately have some folks within the Chinese bureaucracy who are arguing that a code of conduct is in Beijing's interest. But you clearly have just as strong or stronger a voice from the guys who are building military barracks and radar facilities and missile shelters. And, if nothing else, we should be preparing for the eventuality that, maybe those guys win the argument and we get back to a place of China using force or the threat of force rather than actually seeking a code of conduct.
Any final thoughts, comments, questions from the audience? Okay, there being none, thank you very much everyone for your questions and comments.